Okay. The Shooting by Tom Baker. Prologue. This book is a silent concert. Tanner Benjamin rolled around in bed and stared at the ceiling. Outside, a lightning storm seemed to have been imported from some classic Universal monster film. All that was missing was the maniac presence of a Colin Clive or the sepulchral, withered features of Ernest Thesiger. It was perfect nightmare weather, and that was what Tanner had been having. His dream, however, had been more than a dream. It had been a revelation. Unfortunately, he had no idea how to put it all together, or what it really meant, but it was so damned eerie he found sleep at this point to be impossible. It was as if he was connected to some vast, computerized intelligence. He could see the world, or at least his small portion of it, like it was a form of diagram or schematic. He realized then, in the small hours of the morning, that all of life is interconnected in a strange way that is nearly, without the aid at least of some system of consciousness expansion, impossible for the typical workaday mind to conceive. He closed his eyes. He was gone again unexpectedly. At precisely that moment, and that moment was either damned late or damned early, depending on your perspective, two young men who had sold their souls away for bitter herbs and sickened bellies looked at their collection of pornographic DVD movies. They found it to be completely dissatisfying, and one of them remarked, "I wonder what it would be like to rape someone." The other man, a tall, lanky man who was popular with young women, looked at him and said, "Why don't you try it and find out?" The two young men laughed, although the remark had not been funny. Across town, Kevin Hickman was sitting in a bar by himself, wondering what had happened to his life. He hefted the glass to his lips. He swilled down the dark, foul-tasting beer. It no longer held any sensation for him to drink. He had become numb inside and out. It was honest addiction that kept him going. "Hey man, you want to come up to my place and smoke a joint?" The man sitting next to him was very drunk. He was a mental patient of Hickman's acquaintance, a guy they called Electric Jake because of his brief supposed history of electroconvulsive therapy. The bar was nearly silent. Only a few tired souls dotted the respective benches of the great long wooden tables. "Sure, hell yeah, let's do it." Kevin finished his beer with one gulp, slid off the stool, and followed the smaller, swaying man outside. Outside, the decrepit storefronts that had seen so many businesses come and go over the years looked black and inviolate. It looked like they were keeping the secrets of the city at bay. Hickman followed the little man around the dark corner, down a block, past a waiting police officer, and then both men disappeared into a hole in the wall that led up a precarious, foul-smelling flight of stairs into a cubby with a bed and a toilet. Home. Several blocks away and closer to the bridge, in a little house that had seen far better days, Jill Lavender sat cross-legged on her couch, smoking a cigarette in the darkness of the night. Bruce had not bothered to come home. Bruce was staying out with his buddies more and more these days. He always told her she wasn't his, quote, mother, unquote. But damn it, she was his lover, and it bothered her. And something else bothered her, too. Something she had heard from a friend of hers. Little Lindsay was upstairs, no doubt snuggled away in the bosom of sleep. She loved the kid. She also felt damn guilty, too. Lindsay deserved a decent man to be her father. Unfortunately, Jill Lavender had had a habit of picking out shitheels to be her lovers' boyfriends' husbands. The habit had started in high school with Lindsay's biological father. She looked at the ridiculous TV programming. It was all infomercials at this hour. A very tanned, very aerobic-looking senior man with busy, A very tanned, very aerobic-looking senior man was busy juicing different varieties of fruits and vegetable matter. She flipped the channel. Now a highly spastic individual wearing a purple Joker suit covered in question marks was telling her about the wonders of government grants. She wanted to bawl. She puffed at her long, skinny cigarette. The smoke curled into little clouds of noxious vapor in the cathode ray glare of the television. Maybe she should put in a video. Steel Magnolias or something. Damn him, she said to herself bitterly. I'm still fairly young. I'm still good looking. Why does he want anybody else? Tanner Benjamin rolled and kicked furiously in his sleep. He could see it again plainly. It was all interconnected. It was all a vast connection of different invisible life streams and time loops. His brain told him he was standing in the kitchen at Delsonos. You better hurry your ass up, man. It's getting backed up out there. Tanner moved at speeds human beings could barely comprehend. He filled endless racks with dirty dishes, slamming the mouth of the washer closed. The audible whoosh of the sprayer sounded like a hurricane drone in the theater of his sleeping mind. He was alone in the kitchen. Where was everyone? He could see the waitress come in. He couldn't see her face. She didn't seem to have a face. She walked away on incredibly grotesque, backward-facing legs. It looked as if she had traded legs with an obscure, featherless breed of giant bird. He wanted to vomit. He could feel slime in his soul. Suddenly, he heard the barking report of what sounded like a cannon. He rushed from the dish room, flinging open the door, and ran out into the maelstrom of the darkened bar. All that he could remember after that was blood, terror, screaming, and a body floating like some elegant flower cast off into the ocean. How it crumpled. It was a female body, so beautiful it made him want to weep. He bolted upright in bed, sweat beading his form. Outside, a crack of thunder and a flash of lightning illuminated the dull little room he called home. He got up from bed slowly, quietly, and slipped on his jeans. The two young men who had sold their spirits stood outside in the sprawling backyard owned by the oldest man's father. They watched the lightning play its magic upon the sky, and the trees swish and dance and shake in the wind. They could feel their own hideousness in the midst of this grand display. Kyle, what? We are going to hell, aren't we? He considered. The lightning threw a jagged spear across the heavens. Yes? Do you care? I mean that we're damned. Pause. No? Good, because if you don't care, well, then that makes it easier for me. Because I know we have to do this now, man. I can feel it out here tonight. Can you? I can feel the presence. It seemed for a moment like the two men could see an infernal black shape move in the trees and bushes. They fancied it might be the devil himself. At that same moment, Lindsay Lavender put her little face on her arm and began weeping in her sleep. Secluded in a tiny, foul-smelling cubby that hadn't been cleaned within recent memory, Kevin Hickman and Electric Jake passed a very thick, very powerful joint between each other. Hickman had been drinking all night. He looked as if he smelled as bad as he felt. The lightning and wind conspired to cast the old building they sat in to its heels. Kevin looked over his shoulder, out the ancient window pane, and said, his voice the sound of dragging tires, I hope your apartment makes it through the storm, man. Electric Jake had slumped into a ratty armchair that looked as if it had been pulled from the dumpster of the local Salvation Army, and could barely keep his eyes open. He mumbled something barely intelligible. "No, didn't you hear me? I said the storm might tear this apartment down. Man, I think I better be heading." Kevin Hickman made sure to bogue the roach. Old Jake was too far gone already to even notice. Hell with him. Kevin managed to find himself back out on the street. He walked warily down the sidewalk. His place was an ancient house of monumental ugliness and disrepair. But it was, at least, a roof. Darkness, darkness, all around him darkness and loneliness. Walking back to your room before the dawn, when the world slept through its nightmares, and being alone was one of the hardest things he had to get used to. It looked surreal, the faded bricks, the old storefront windows. Many men had walked here before for over a century back. Did any of their ghosts still beat these pavement with tired shoes? He crossed over by the flower boutique, past an old bank building, heading into his own neighborhood. He was able to pick out the frame of the vast edifice through his bleary, dope-addled eyes. He managed his way into the side door. He didn't notice, but one of the cars that passed him as he walked carried a very beautiful female form. He would meet that same woman in 2 nights, and though he would never in his life actually get to know her, his meeting with her would be an integral part of the story that was told later. And hello? Secluded in a tiny, foul-smelling cubby that hadn't been cleaned within recent memory, Kevin Hickman and Electric Jake passed a very thick, very powerful joint between each other. Hickman had been drinking all night. He looked as if he smelled as bad as he felt. The lightning and wind conspired to cast the old building they sat in to its heels. Kevin looked over his shoulder, out the ancient window pane, and said, his voice the sound of dragging tires, "I hope your apartment makes it through the storm, man." Electric Jake had slumped into a ratty armchair that looked as if it had been pulled from the dumpster of the local Salvation Army, and could barely keep his eyes open. He mumbled something barely intelligible. "No, didn't you hear me? I said the storm might tear this apartment down, man. I think I better be heading." Kevin Hickman made sure to bogue the roach. Old Jake was too far gone already to even notice. Hell with him. Kevin managed to find himself back out on the street. He walked warily down the sidewalk. His place was an ancient house of monumental ugliness and disrepair. But it was, at least, a roof. Darkness, darkness, all around him darkness and loneliness. Walking back to your room before the dawn, when the world slept through its nightmares, and being alone, was one of the hardest things he had had to get used to. It looked surreal, the faded bricks, the old storefront windows. Many men had walked here before for over a century back. Did any of their ghosts still beat these pavements with tired shoes? He crossed over by the flower boutique, past an old bank building, heading into his own neighborhood. He was able to pick out the frame of the vast edifice through his bleary, dope-addled eyes. He managed his way into the side door. He didn't notice, but one of the cars that passed him as he walked carried a very beautiful female form. He would meet this same woman in 2 nights, and though he would never in his life actually get to know her, his meeting with her would be an integral part of the story that was told later and sold on checkout lines in cheap rags across the USA. Even the name of Kevin Hickman would have a sort of 15-minute brush with celebrity. But he didn't know that then, as he walked into the darkened kitchen, past the pool table, into the large foyer that had once belonged to a single family. He walked up the stairs slowly. There was a doorway on the second landing that led to a side section that was all small rooms that could have accommodated college classes. The building had been added onto, changed around, demolished, and brought back up again in such a haphazard fashion that the architectural layout was nearly occult. On the uppermost floor, there was an abandoned vintage diner that dated from right after World War II. Even Kevin Hickman sometimes got the shivers in this house. Age is not our friend, he reflected. Professor Milt's C-bomb shoveled in a cold turkey TV dinner. He always bought around 10 of them every payday. He went through them damn quick. Ah, the bitter hours of morning restlessness. Luckily, he didn't have classes to teach today. Lucky for him, because he was damn irascible on no sleep. He wanted another one, thought better of it, and set the plastic tray on his nightstand. Who cared if he was a slob? Not like he had ever had many visitors. Good night, Mr. Chips. The lightning and thunder were grand, really. He could see out the filmy curtain how intense, how alive nature was, and it always struck him as somewhat sad that his own nature was so restricted, so formal, so repressed. Then he closed his eyes. He remembered who he was. He was Dr. Milton H. Seabaum. He was a cultured man, a man who had spent his entire life in pursuit of learning and teaching. Romance, he surmised, was not for everyone. He drifted into sleep. His dreams were all permutations of the same theme. He was holding back an army of drooling, pathetic ogres with a single torch of illumination. That torch was all that meant anything to him, but he was lost in a wilderness alone, and the wind was blowing, and the fire was beginning to dim. Tanner stood in front of the rooming house with a cigarette clasped in his shaking fingers. He was half terrified of the storm, but found it exhilarating in equal measure. His half-awake mind was still focusing on the images of his strange dream. The darkened panic, gunshots, the falling woman. Later, Tanner would go back upstairs and sleep. His dreams would become even more troubled. Dreams chiefly concerned with decay, with deformity, with themes of distress and repressed anger. Around him the world slept, awoke, shuddered, breathed, sobered, suffered, and waited. And this was only one morning, just before dawn. Part 1. 1. It was the pounding down force of the music that seemed to rock them all to a sort of religious ecstasy. Wasn't it, after all, the tribal drum beats of certain native African witch doctors that were supposed to call forth the spirits from beyond? He wasn't sure. He could hardly see now why it even mattered. There were an assortment of skinny young girls here, all clad in the same regulation black scuffed jeans worn gray at the seams by the endless moving of the material of shapely, skinny young hips. It was a real gasser to look at. Tanner was so drunk he could barely stand up. He kept walking around the room, minutes passing by in the firmament of time, making the late evening into the early morning. He passed some drunken man who was busily rubbing the crotch of a hopeful amour. In the kitchen, the guitar player was having a heartfelt conversation about beating up some of his classmates at a young age. Tanner sincerely hoped he didn't, tonight, decide to demonstrate his technique upon the weaker ones assembled. The air was heavy with the smoke of cannabis, marijuana, dank, call it what you will. He took a regulation puff. He needed to make these people feel calm. It was a communal thing amongst grass smokers to pass a little. But don't bogue the joint, and for God's sake, don't think on anybody's weed. It was beyond the pale of what could be considered proper etiquette to do such a thing. Tanner was what a generous person might call, quote, socially inept. It is never a good idea for the socially inept to be intoxicated in a room full of testy egos, all vying for the attention of young ladies of loose virtue. It is never a good idea, but Tanner rarely had good ideas. More often than not, he had trouble. When he had tagged along to this affair, he was, it assumed, still sober enough to maintain his social composure in front of the assembled. He had assumed that, at least. Unfortunately, it was failing to be true. Already he had bumped the swelling breast of the bustiest maiden at the party. It had been completely unintentional, but it was the fact that while it was happening, he had been too astounded to even move. Hell, he was sure he didn't even vibrate for a moment. The tit in question had been kept snugly in a rayon bustier affair that must have dated from at least 1970, but his bare hand, or the back of it at least, had swept down the curving slope of that unseen breast to the pugnacious erection of the nipple in question. The breast that nipple was attached to belonged to a body that was little, well-proportioned, and gabbing drunkenly with the great imbecilic oath of a man that must have been the boyfriend. Tanner, before he even knew it, was being verbally assaulted by a series of harsh, barking voices calling him a plethora of nasty, suggestive names. You fucking asshole, why don't you... Her gapy little face suddenly shot into a million particulates of infinitesimal disgust. Her bonehead boyfriend leaned over and slurred, "Hey, dickface, do you want to meet me outside?" Tanner turned drunkenly, and suddenly a group of several anonymous strangers seemed to stumble between them, cutting Tanner off from almost certain death. But it would not last. A young guy in a tie came ambling into the room. He had blood all over the front of his shirt. Suddenly, Tanner Benjamin felt an icy jab in his ribs. A great explosion of pain sent sparks flying across his field of vision. He had been sucker punched and had been too drunk to see it coming. He fell backwards into a loping retreat, past drunken, sweaty faces, past bony female faces advertising displeasure at the young body hurling itself through space and across the living room floor to the battered screen door that promised a mode of escape from big, authoritative jock boyfriend. Outside, some wilted teenage co-ed was busy throwing up dorm food onto the otherwise nice white driveway. Fresh air hit him like a soothing balm, and he took one deep, shuddering breath to still himself. You could probably hear the music inside several blocks away. He walked, or rather stumbled, off the porch, past the assembled friends of the puking girl, and ambled out into the darkness of the yard. Suddenly behind him loomed the Darth Vader visage of his assailant, a massive quarterback-style silhouette that was making its confused way outside to finish the job it had begun. Tanner realized he would have to hustle away from this ogre quickly, lest the scent of blood arouse the rest of the pack. He began to try and disappear down the sidewalk, weaving in and out between people coming from and going to the party. The ogre simply stood on the porch, following him in the darkness with drunken eyes and holding out one meaty fist, saying, "Yeah, that's right, little boy. You better run. Know you'll get your ass kicked. Messing with my girl." He shouted in short, declarative bursts of bully lingo, but at least Tanner sighed. He was going to let Tanner go. Then the icing on the cake, the one event of the evening that somehow made everything seem a little bit better. The fast approach of the lighted squad car. The party was over for all of those who hadn't been sucker punched. At least. Tanner awoke the next day with his head feeling as big as a basketball and a growing, steady depression related to the fact that in just a few hours he would have to go to work. It was never good going to work with a hangover, no matter how hard you tried, no matter how much Tylenol you took, no matter how concentrated nice you tried to be. For some reason, everybody still knew. They could smell it linger on you like a dog pissing on a tree. Alcohol marked its territory. It was eerie. Worse yet, the world around him and outside his window seemed as gray, as joyless as the onset of old age. He moved tired bones. He promised he would never do it again. He lied. He knew damn well he would. He ambled out of bed and went to the wash basin. In the basin, he looked at his haggard face in the cracked bathroom mirror. Hooray for living. Hooray for fucking life. As he saw it, it had fucked him in the ass before he even knew it had its blood up. He had been born to be the Quasimodo of the social set. A pariah, a dork, a nerd, a, quote, young, insignificant, or inexperienced person, unquote. In other words, a four-eyed punk, a runty troll, a guy that would never make the chess team, let alone the football team. He applied a huge swell of lather to his chops and commenced shaving. It was going to make it more endurable, he decided, to be cleaned up, to be free of the sweat and funk of first the bar and then the horrible party he had wandered into. He smiled. The party had gotten busted just as he was forced to leave. He could still see Darth Vader standing on the porch, his overdeveloped arm extended in a threatening finger-pointing gesture that must have really turned his girlfriend on. Cocksucker. Fucking jock. Jocks think they own everything just because they have muscles on their muscles. Fucking cock. Tanner was so enraged for a moment he wanted to crush his own image in the mirror. Then he decided that this was probably bad luck. More bad luck he didn't need. He started to scratch the blade across his face. It felt good to be getting the stuff off his ample cheeks. Nobody liked a pudgy dwarf, but they didn't like them even more if they had beard scruff. So, he didn't cut himself. The way his head was swimming, it felt like he was destined to cut himself. Scritch, scratch. Scritch, scratch. Scritch, scratch. Whoosh. He rinsed the blade off, looked at the tiny molecules of growth floating in the dank water. He looked in the mirror at his eyes. Totally bloodshot. Totally alien. Those eyes held a lot of impotent rage this morning. Those eyes had not been loved since those eyes could remember. Those eyes looked out upon the world that most people thought of as beautiful, and J. Tanner Benjamin thought looked like a pile of fresh dog shit. He walked out of the bathroom and looked at the phone. How much did he have in savings? Couple hundred? Enough to pay another month's rent? He had always been a conscientious saver. Call off. Better yet, just call those bastards up and say, "Fuck you, I'm out of here." Boy, that would be rich. Boy, that would be a lot of fun. Did he have the nerve? He approached the phone slowly. His rumpled, cool covers looked as inviting, as enticing as anything he had ever seen before in his life. He wanted to desperately crawl in between them, pull them up over his head, and forget about the maddening pace and confusion of the world. If he went into work, it was going to be busting his ass until 1 o'clock in the morning, washing dishes for a bunch of jock animals that he hated anyway. A bunch of drunk frat guys and their slutty cyber babe girlfriends. It was damn loud in that sports bar, what with karaoke and shouted conversations, and even back in the kitchen it was so loud sometimes you felt like you had just stuck your head inside a wind tunnel and hit a button labeled hurricane. Could he take it? Could he deal with it feeling like he did? Call off, call off, call off. It was 1:45. If he dialed them with some lame-ass excuse now, they would A, can him when he did come in tomorrow, or B, demand he bring in proof of his illness, like a doctor's slip. In which case he was back to A. It was Saturday night, too. It would be busy as all hell in there, and with no dishwasher and no notice, really, and he knew he was making up excuses to be a chicken shit. What would Dad do in this case, he wondered. Plainly, Dad would have done his American best, as Dad always did. Dad would have gone to work, toughed it out, been a man, did his best for God and country and the IRS. Dad had been an athlete in school. Dad didn't much understand his quiet, bookish boy. Tanner sat down naked on the bed with only a robe wrapped around him. His fingers trembled as he reached for the long, snaking phone line. It felt evil coiled in his grasp. He pulled it toward him, finally, with a mounting sense of conviction. It is imperative that I manage, he said to himself, somehow, to retain a sense of my sanity. If I go to work now, I will be filled to the brim with malignant rage. I will be noticeably mentally unhinged. We can't allow that to happen. We won't allow that to happen. If needs be, I have sufficient savings to fall back on in case of dire emergencies. I can make it. I have never called off before. They will understand. As he picked up the phone, his first words were, hello, this is Tanner Benjamin. My father just passed away. End of chapter 1, part 1. Saturn in retrograde.